Good afternoon or evening, and welcome. Kensington Senior Living has 7 unique communities, 4 located in Virginia, Maryland, and New York, and 3 sister communities located in California. Kensington is truly privileged to support care partners and professionals from coast to coast. Kensington focuses on relationship-based care, care built on the foundation of our promise to love and care for your family as we do our own. That promise was what initially drew me to become a member of the Kensington family, as my father lived there for almost 7 years. It is programs such as the one you are attending now that are so important for those of us walking through a caregiving journey to hear from expert professionals on keeping us current with latest advances in care, management, and treatment of conditions that affect seniors and their families. Today, Kensington is honored to partner with Casey Dieters and Jessica Resak of Mary S. Easton Center for Alzheimer's Research and Care to present today's educational webinar on genetics, risk factors, and signs of neurodegenerative brain diseases. Did you know that genetics can play a significant role in a neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal, dementia, and more? Well, you are about to find out. Please know that we will email a copy of today's webinar to all registrants to share with friends and family, along with links to connect you with UCLA. You should receive this in the next few days. Now, please join me in welcoming Monica Moore. Hello, Monica.
Hello, Susan. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Good afternoon and evening. Please share a few words with our audience about yourself and present today's webinar, and I'll see you for the Q&A. Take care.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Kensington Senior Living for this great partnership. My name is Monica Moore. I am the Community Health Program Manager for the Mary S. Easton Center for Alzheimer's Research and Care at UCLA. We are a comprehensive care center that focuses on doing good work to face this world of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. We have a clinical program where people can come and get proper diagnosis. We have clinical trials where we're trying to figure out the latest in research. We have research as well, the scientists in the labs who are trying to figure out all of this information that we're going to be talking about today. And then we also have support programs for our families, so with our caregiver support groups. I am very pleased and very honored today to be able to have 2 wonderful representatives of UCLA and the neurology department. And Casey, shoot, I'm drawing a blank. I know you're not with neurology. You'll fill me in on that one in a minute. But Casey is a wonderful, both of our presenters are excellent today, and I'm very happy to be able to be here with them. First of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Jessica Resak. She is an assistant professor of neurology at UCLA, a lovely person and a wonderful opportunity to listen to her today. I think I can listen to her speak all day. We don't have quite that long today, but I'm going to turn the camera and the microphone over to Jessica. So if you could give a brief introduction of yourself, Jessica, and then get on with your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Kensington, for sponsoring this. I know there's a lot of questions out there about the genetics of Alzheimer's and other dementias, and so I'm excited for the opportunity to talk about that a little bit. And thank you, Monica. To introduce myself, I'm a neurologist here at UCLA. I see patients in our Alzheimer's clinic. I also see patients in our neurogenetics clinic. We have an adult neurogenetics clinic. So I'm happy to represent from that background. I also have a lab at UCLA where we use genetics to try to understand disease. And I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. So highlights, we have discussion opportunities and Q&A coming up. So I just wanted to present some basic concepts to get us started today. The first thing that I wanted to clarify is this question of what is dementia? People often ask me, what is dementia? Well, dementia is actually functionally defined. So when somebody has cognitive impairment that's so severe that they can no longer function normally to do the things that they need to do on a day-to-day basis, we say that's dementia. And it's often the result of a degenerative disease. And there's actually different kinds of degenerative diseases that can cause dementia. Now, we all know Alzheimer's disease. It's the most common kind of dementia that we find in especially elderly populations. And it's specific for the buildup of certain toxic proteins in the brain. Things like amyloid and tau together define the brain of an Alzheimer's dementia patient. And when you think about dementia in general, we know that there are certain things that increase our risk. One of them is age. So this is one that we can all observe when we look around in our community, that as we get older, we see more of those amongst us having degenerative disorders and dementia. And we start to see cases in particular over the age of 65 and even more 75. Race and ethnicity actually has a role, and I hope that Dr. Casey Dieter will inform us a little bit more about this later, as she's an expert in this area. But what we observe is that older African Americans, for example, are twice as likely to have dementia, and also Hispanics are more likely to have dementia. So this is an area that we need to understand better. One thing that I put here with a lot of stars is that there's actually poor health in general as a major contributor to the risk of dementia. And that includes things like untreated high blood pressure and high cholesterol and smoking. And big stars, because these are things that can be missed, that we think back, too bad, because if we had taken better care of blood pressure, et cetera, we could have modified this. So when I see patients, one of the first things that we do is we go through all of their health history and their health, and we really make sure we aren't missing anything here that we could be doing better on. Another one is traumatic brain injury. So this is there's a condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy that occurs, for example, in some people in the NFL who get their head trauma, or in the military. And it's interesting, it doesn't happen to everybody. It seems to happen to some more than others. And we're just beginning to understand that a little bit now. And then in red, the topic of today, genetic factors. So we know this. We know that there are families where more people get dementia than other families. And this is particularly true for Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia. So we're going to talk about genes today. I found this picture in Google from Fuzzy Synapse, and I thought it was a really helpful picture to help us think about what are we talking about when we're talking about genetics and DNA. So the genome is a cookbook, and every cell has that cookbook. Imagine, or you could even think of it as an encyclopedia. It's the A to Z. And every cell in our body has this cookbook. And it includes 2.5 billion nucleotides, that's the little rungs here on the ladder, and 22,000 genes. So every cell in the body needs to use the cookbook to make the recipe. And different recipes are made at different times. There's the Christmas dinner, there's, the whatever, taco night, and they come back to the cookbook for those instructions, and then they make it by the book, if you will. So different cells and different times are going to be making different recipes. And some cell types like to make certain things, and other cell types like to make others. And in the end, you also get protein. That's a machinery, if you would. It's the Legos of the body that actually builds the structures and the cars and the dinosaurs and things. I have 4 kids, so I think about Legos all the time. So we're in this genomic age of medicine where we have these new technologies. This here is a picture of a sequencer. It has revolutionized medicine. And the cost of sequencing the human genome has plummeted. So, you go back to the beginning of 2000, and it was $100 million to sequence the human genome. It was this huge event when one person got sequenced. And now it's actually $250 if you do it in the lab, but it costs $2,500 to do this with a quality commercial lab for an individual to get their whole genome sequenced. But this is, this is a huge drop, right? So we're learning a lot now, because now finally, for the first time in human history, we can sequence a whole lot of people. And what are we learning? We're learning that not everyone has the same DNA, okay? And that's what we call variation. On average, if I take myself and I compare myself to someone who's not in my family, some random person going by, and you compare the two of us, 1 out of 1,000 of our DNA nucleotides, those rungs on the ladder, will be different. So the two of us on average will have 3 million nucleotides that are different, but that's only 0.1% of our DNA. So it's actually not that different. Actually, most of us are pretty common. We're pretty similar to one another at the DNA level, much more so than compared to some species that have been around much longer than humans have. Okay, so we often think about studies now that are comparing the genes of people from different continents. What do people look like in Europe versus people from Africa? And when we look at those studies, we can see that only of the 0.01% that's different amongst us, most of it is not divided by continents, but about 10% of it can be more skewed, and it can help us actually understand where people's ancestors came from. So when we look also at these DNA studies, now we can look at DNA from people who lived, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, and we can understand how the changes that we see today came along in the human genome. And we've learned that actually there were certain times in history where like our access to certain foods and our exposure to certain infections caused a big change in what our genes looked like. And the interesting thing is, as we look today, we find that there are DNA changes that are actually impacting our risk of diseases like Alzheimer's. So that's where this is all going. Because if you take a group of people and you say, who has Alzheimer's disease by age 65, by age 85, there's a reasonable way of predicting that based on all of this genetic variation. Now, it's not perfect. We don't do it clinically, because when you do this clinically, you kind of need to be perfect. But when we do it in research studies, we can take, for example, twins, and we can measure their genes, and we can say, based on that lifetime risk of Alzheimer's disease is about 60 to 70% determined by your genetic makeup. And what age people are likely to get it, either a little bit earlier or a little bit later, is also determined by genes. So that's a pretty big chunk of that risk is coming from our genetics. And there's a spectrum here. This is a really fancy slide. It's used in a bazillion fancy academic talks, but it's such a great depiction of this contrast between gene mutations that are super, super rare. So this is on the left side here. So it's very rare on the bottom. And then when you look to the top, there's 3 genes that cause autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease. So these are the genes that really by themselves, if individuals have them, can determine one gene makes the determination, does this person have a really high risk of getting Alzheimer's disease in their life? Almost 100% if they live long enough. But they're super rare. Those are super, super rare. When we look at people more commonly, we're measuring a whole lot of genes. I mentioned this like big component of Alzheimer's disease. It's actually genes that are really common. And it's the group of them collectively all together that influences our risks. Each one of them influences that risk by a teeny tiny amount. Somewhere in the middle is APOE. And we know a lot about APOE. And APOE is a gene that is involved in the brain's inflammatory response and the way that cholesterol is handled in the body. And when individuals have one copy of the APOE variant, it increases the risk here. I put 3 times. It's actually 2.5 times compared to individuals who don't. So I want to talk a little bit more about APOE, because this is the one people know about the most, they have the most questions about, and I think it's worth taking a little bit of a pause on this. It's very common. Okay, so we talked about variants. We talked about how not everybody has the same sequence for a certain area of DNA. So there's these 3 variants for APOE that we talk about, E2, E3, and E4. If you look at the population, particularly Caucasians, 70% of them are E3. So most people are E3. 20% of them are E4. So, almost 1 out of 5, it is 1 out of 5. 1 out of 5 people has an E4, very, very common. 10% are E2, so 1 out of 10 have a copy of E2. And that's helpful because E2 is predictive. So people who have an E2 have half the chance of getting Alzheimer's disease in their life. Still substantial chance because a lot of people get this disease, but it's better. It's actually half. And E4 increases that chance by 2 to 3-fold. And then a double E4 increases it even more. So here's a picture of what that group of people looks like, if they're E3 versus E4. And it's actually quite interesting. The exact number of people who get Alzheimer's disease based on age and E3, E4 status actually differs quite a bit in different studies. It's about 10% difference in different studies. So I took an average from multiple studies to draw this out for us. So this is people who are in their 80s. And on the left are the number of people who get Alzheimer's disease out of that group. And on the right, if they have E4, more of them will get Alzheimer's disease. But you'll see that in the E3 group, there are people who don't. It's also remarkable how many people have Alzheimer's disease in this handful of people here. And then in the E4 group, we see that there's plenty of people who have E4 who don't get Alzheimer's disease. So it's a risk modifier, but it's not a determining 100% type of mutation. And there's some interesting stuff we're learning now about how E4 varies in different groups. Most of the studies came out of European populations. And I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Dieters now, Casey, who I think has a lot to teach us about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's always so interesting just to hear the world of risk. I think lots of people, they think about, oh, my mom had it. What does it mean? Or there's a lot of press that the world of E4 or APOE4 gets. So I really think that this is a great conversation. So next we have Dr. Casey Dieters, who again, great pleasure to have her here with me. While I was off camera, she's in the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology. So no wonder I didn't get that straight at the beginning, but she is a neuroscientist by training. So we're very happy and honored to be able to have her here with us today. We're going to allow Dr. Dieters to speak for a bit, and then I'm going to bring back both of our presenters, and we're going to have a really great Q&A. We figured for today's presentation, we wanted that to be the bulk. You're here, you have questions. Let's get your questions answered. So save your questions, or if you want, start putting them in the chat, start formulating them right now, and we'll be able to have a great conversation after Dr. Dieters presents. Go ahead, Casey. Thank you.
You think by now I would know how to work Zoom. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I also want to really thank the Kensington Senior Living facility for allowing me here to speak with you today. As Monica Moore mentioned, I'm Dr. Casey Dieters. I am a professor here at UCLA, and my lab studies Alzheimer's disease risk factors, specifically for the Black community, but I do focus on other minoritized communities such as Asian individuals and Hispanic individuals as well. So yeah, let's get right into it. And I also want to thank Dr. Resak for setting this up beautifully. I just want to recap a few things she said. Dementia is what we like to call an umbrella term. So there's a lot of different types of dementia. And as Dr. Resak said, Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. It progressively worsens over time. And unfortunately, we don't have a cure right now because we don't even really fully understand what the cause of Alzheimer's disease is. But it is, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call are aware, one of the most prevalent dementias that we have. So I'm going to walk through this table or this graph because I think it's really a great example to show, a lot of times we want to know what are the dementia rates across different ethnic and racial groups. And so this here shows the incidence rate of dementia. So higher number is more the higher rate of dementia. And then we have different ethnic or racial groups that are shown here. So for example, in the blue bar, we have those who identify as Black or African American, people who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, people who identify as Latino, Pacific Islander, white, or Asian American. So we have all of these different ethnic and racial groups that are represented here in America. And actually, this data is from Northern California. And we can see that people who identify as Black have the highest rate of dementia relative to other ethnic or racial groups. Especially relative to white individuals. You can see it's actually almost twice the rate of white individuals. And this is a problem when we actually do our research because a lot of research is focused on white individuals. And, a lot of the risk factors we're defining, we're trying to apply that to other minoritized or racial groups in America. And sometimes, the results are just different between groups. And so that's what my lab is really interested in studying is what are the risk factors that we've identified in white Americans and how do they apply to other groups? Again, setting up exactly what Dr. Resak talked about is APOE4. APOE4, the largest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease that we know about. So the frequency of APOE4, so the frequency of APOE4 being the number that it's present in the population, can have an effect on the risk for Alzheimer's disease. So here we have a map of the world, and then we have APOE4 allele frequency is color-coded. So the darker colors or the warmer colors here of red shows a much higher APOE4 allele frequency. So for example, the continent of Africa has a really high frequency of APOE4, while if you look at North America here, you see a much lower frequency of APOE4 and an actual even lower frequency of APOE4 in Mexico, for example, relative to the United States. So looking at APOE4 frequency across the world, again, E4 is the risk allele, so higher frequency, you might think that that would contribute to a higher prevalence or incident rate of dementia, as I showed in that previous graph. So you might think, okay, Black individuals are having this higher rate of dementia because there's a higher frequency of E4. So that's gotta correlate, right? In fact, we see that that's actually not one of the reasons why. So again, this is just showing the E4 frequency. This is the percentage of E4, the risk allele. And you can see that Black individuals who are healthy do have a higher frequency of E4 relative to other ethnic and racial groups. But when we look at people with Alzheimer's disease, if you look at the number of Alzheimer's disease Black individuals with E4, the frequency of E4 is almost identical to white individuals with Alzheimer's disease and the E4 allele. So even though E4 has this higher frequency in the Black population, it's not actually translating or the cause of why Black individuals are having a higher incident rate of dementia. And we can see some dissimilar actually trends. Hispanic individuals have a lower frequency of APOE4 relative to white and Black individuals. And actually Hispanic have a lower rate of the frequency for Alzheimer's disease. And same thing with those who identify as Japanese, they actually have the lowest, this group actually has the lowest frequency of APOE4 in people who are healthy overall. But in Alzheimer's disease, you can see that there's still a really high number of people that identify as Japanese and have the APOE4 allele. So while the APOE4 allele is a really significant risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, no matter what ethnic or racial group you are, the amount of that effect is going to vary depending on your ethnic or racial background, or may vary depending on your background. And so what are some other potential risk factors then, for these other, for groups that identify as Black, Asian American, or Hispanic? We've talked about biology, APOE4, but some other really important factors for minority groups can include behavioral, physical, or built environment, sociocultural environment, and healthcare system. So lack of access to healthcare is really, really big in minority populations due to a whole host of systemic issues. But, a lot of times it takes a lot longer for minority individuals to go to the doctor and seek help for the same issues that are being faced. So it's really important to look beyond biology, beyond APOE4 for potential risk factors. So it's not just individual health, but there's also interpersonal health, or you can call this as family organizational health. There's household environment, social networks actually have an association with a risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. There are community levels of influence for developing risk of Alzheimer's disease. There's herd immunity, community environment, resources in your community is a really, really big one as well. And especially when we think about minority populations, discrimination is a really big one, whether it's faced in the community, but also in the healthcare system. And again, going back to that access to quality healthcare. There's also, going to another level, societal risk factors. So for example, sanitation, policies and laws, societal structure, social norms, quality of healthcare. Again, there's just so many different levels to an individual's that an individual faces in order to increase or decrease their likelihood for developing Alzheimer's disease. So while APOE4 is this really large genetic risk factor, I just want to point out that there are other really important risk factors as well, in particular for minority or racialized communities. And just to expand on that as well, there are other potentially modifiable risk factors. So modifiable meaning things that we might be able to change. So this was a really cool study that was done that looked beyond genetics. And you can kind of look at this as like the path of your life, from early life to midlife to later life. So this would be like older adult. And this midlife would be like around your 40s or 50s. So it looks like having education actually accounts for 7% of your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so this means that if we could potentially change the issue of poor education when we're a child, this might actually contribute to an individual's risk on top of the genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease. Same thing in midlife, you have hearing loss contributing 8%, traumatic brain injury, with which Dr. Rezac touched on a little bit, talking about brain injury, that's about 3% of your risk, hypertension, alcohol, obesity. And then going to later life, there are other non-genetic contributors to Alzheimer's disease, such as smoking, depression, social isolation, physical inactivity, air pollution, diabetes. The point of this is that there's about 40% of potentially modifiable genetic risk. I'm sorry, ignore the genetic part. There's a 40% of potentially modifiable non-genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And on average, there's about, APOE4 contributes around 30% of your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So just some today's takeaways before we get into discussion. Again, there are 3 APOE alleles that were touched on: APOE2, APOE3, and APOE4, but E4 is the one with the largest risk. But although it increases your risk, it is not the cause for Alzheimer's disease, right? This is just something that, again, contributes around 30% of your risk to Alzheimer's disease. While there are other factors like social factors and behaviors that can impact your risk for AD, especially for minoritized communities, and of course, lifestyle choices from early, and this matters across your lifespan, from early life to later life. So diet, exercise, things that we talked about that you can potentially modify. And so with that, I'm going to end, and thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so very much, Casey. I really appreciate your insight and your knowledge base, especially talking about the disparities that exist. I think we've seen a lot of that, especially it's really come to light in the past few years with COVID. I think it brought it to a whole new world of awareness than it has ever been before. So I think now it's a really great opportunity as well to bring it in to talk about the world of dementia risk as well. So I'd like to bring back Jessica as well, if you are available, and also Susan, to see if you are available as well right now, so we can open up and have a Q&A. We did have a number of questions that were posed at the beginning at registration, so we have some of those. But for all of you who are here right now, you're here. You showed up, those other people didn't. So we want your questions. Make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A, and we will make sure that we get to as many as possible. If we do not get to all of the questions today, we will do our very best to reach out to you if we have your contact information to be able to help answer some of your questions. We believe so much in the world of having a dialogue. That's why we do these presentations, and that's why we enjoy the aspect of the virtual world. We can reach people who normally wouldn't be able to be in a room together. So Susan, should I turn it over to you to begin with some of the Q&A?
Absolutely. But Casey, I was so impressed with both of your presentations, but my father passed away from Alzheimer's. And so, you know, we always talk about modifiable and we talk about the gene. and all that stuff. But I just really, it resonated with me, the interpersonal and community levels of influence, because it seems so obvious, but it's not so obvious. And I just so appreciated that perspective about how it's just not a level playing field. And I thought that was wonderful. I can't wait to rewatch this webinar, actually, because I was trying to take notes as quick as I could, but I can't wait to send it to my family and friends. So thank you. Actually, Monica, I have a question for you. It kind of came in at the live, and it was a little bit for people that submitted questions at registration, and that is both Casey and Jessica talked about the modifiable and how if you really you have your lifestyle with modifiable risk factors. Obviously, you can't modify your genes, at least not yet, but and you can decrease your chance by 40%. Monica, are there other anti-inflammatory remedies that could be suggested?
If we're talking specifically anti-inflammatory, I'm going to pass that one over to Jessica.
Okay.
If we're talking more about the world of what can we do to truly reduce our own personal risk, regardless, again, we can't change our parents, like, for better or for worse. But it's the world of looking at these different factors, the lifestyle. But it's also, I think, a big key part that people think about diet, they think about exercise. But again, it goes back to that world as being social. And I think that's what we saw a lot during COVID, is that decline of the socialization, the interaction, the engagement that really does benefit a person cognitively, and can also sort of help build a bit of a reserve as well as we age. It's whoever came today is a step in the right direction,
Right.
learning.
An add-on to that was organic foods. Can eating organic foods assist with my inflammatory response? So Jessica, you're on.
I study inflammation and Alzheimer's disease. So, there were studies of epidemiologic uncontrolled studies, like in the 90s, and that suggested that there may be a protective effect of over-the-counter anti-inflammatories. And then they went back and tried to actually do controlled studies, and they didn't reproduce any of those findings. But it opened the floodgates to thinking about targeting inflammation in Alzheimer's disease. And there's a lot of work in this area, and we haven't whittled it down to anything that's really, ready to go. But it's part of this kind of growing appreciation of the generalized role of inflammation in age-related diseases. And if you want to think about where we have our observations and what we give concretely to patients as specific recommendations for prevention that relate to it, the idea of exercise, which we know reduces inflammation because you're metabolizing and cleaning up a lot of byproducts in your body every time you go and exercise. And these anti-inflammatory diets that are defined by the lipid composition, actually. There are certain lipids that you eat. So lipids is fat in certain foods that actually make less inflammatory molecules that function in the body. And where we go with that is the omega-3s, and the eat fish and eat, healthy oils, Mediterranean diet, all of those things that have come down in trials like the Fingers trials and the Pointer trial as recommendations that are helpful, make a nudge for age-related degenerative diseases. Those all have to do with kind of like that healthy eating. I haven't seen any studies that directly point to organic, but I think there is increasing concern about toxins on foods and in our world, and people are just starting to look. But I think, we know what's healthy, and those healthier fats, the fats that come from plants and nuts are less inflammatory. But lots of drug companies are working on trying to find a good immune modulatory drug that will help for Alzheimer's disease, and we're just not there yet.
I thank goodness for folks like all of you that can hopefully push the needle forward. Casey,
Oh, I was
yes.
gonna say, Susan, I want to make one little thing here, is people often stress about organics. But if your budget doesn't allow for organics, then don't stress about organics.
Yes.
Still just make sure you get the food that the brain healthy food. People stress so much, I think especially here in LA or, you know, other parts of where it's, oh, organic is is good. If I just got regular spinach, oh, it's not as good for me. Actually, you know what? That regular spinach is way better than the iceberg.
And yeah, and
So-
there is no study that shows organic is better for reducing dementia risk. I mean, there's nothing to point to that. I think, you know, the one clear reproducible observation that's kind of compelling is to avoid pollution. So, you know, if you're going to go for a run, don't go for a run on the 405. You know, go to a healthier place, you know. And that's come up from multiple studies, but there has not been any link. I think Monica's absolutely right. These are not things to stress over. And there's a flip side to this too. I don't know if anybody thinks about that. Like, it's so important to recognize that 40%, and that 40% is not just going to pay off for Alzheimer's disease. These are the type of things that reward us for all age-related diseases. We know it. But there's also just this recognition that we can't completely control this, you know, and when it happens, it's not because somebody, you know, didn't eat organic. There's a lot in our human genome, as we talked about, that 60% that was passed on to us from our ancestors who, you know, were being chased by bears and they were dealing with different things, but now it's not working out when we're 80. And it's not our fault, you know. So I think these are great recommendations because they, you know, the eating right, the healthy, because you're going to be rewarded on all fronts. And there's a lot of recommendations out there for like, oh, take this supplement. It's going to cure your Alzheimer's disease. And we got to be really careful about that because that could kind of go the wrong way. But anyway, I think that's kind of the spirit in which to embrace this.
Agreed. If they tell you to eat jellyfish, you might want to think about that one. Casey, I have a question here from Maureen. Is it too late for prevention at age 70?
You know, I think it's never too late to make a lifestyle change for the better, because like Jessica just mentioned, there's overall benefits beyond dementia with a lot of the modifiable factors. So I think, when it comes to genetics, we can't change our genetics, right? But we can definitely choose like to live a healthier lifestyle to help stave off some of the symptoms. Unfortunately, if you have Alzheimer's disease coming, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to stop that. But we can help stave off the symptoms by making some different changes, modifiable changes. And I think that's the important thing to focus on.
Another question for you. I'm Japanese American and my mom has dementia. Where can I get tested? I guess we should ask that to UCLA. And it looks like the graph, the APOE4 gene, is at greater risk for those with Japanese ancestry. Is it dominant, recessive, ? And then adding on to that was a question about what would it cost if I wanted to get my genome done at UCLA. So I'll just try to combine as many as I can with that.
I'll start it off, but I am a neuroscientist by training. I do not see patients. So I'll leave those questions, Jessica, and I'll just answer the first part of that.
Perfect.
So teamwork. so yeah, actually Asian Americans have, and I don't fully know too much. I want to be forthcoming with this just so I don't give the wrong information. I don't study Japanese or Asian Americans in my lab. I know a little bit about it from my research. And so like, for example, what I showed. So actually Asian Americans and Japanese actually have a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. But this is the interesting thing, right? When we look at APOE4 is that even though it's present, it is not causative. And I think that's such a crucial thing to make sure that everyone is aware of that. Just because you did 23andMe or whatever the other one is called, ancestry.com, right? And your results said you have E4, it does not mean that you're going to have any cognitive deficits like memory deficits or dementia. It could be in a heightened risk, but it is not causative. And so, a lot of those charts can be misleading when we're looking at APOE4. However, it's E4 is technically recessive. You need 2 copy to, or it's dose dependent. So that means 1 copy you have, like, if you have no copies, you have a low effect or low impact. 1 copy is kind of middle, and if you have 2 copies, you have the highest effect. So it's called a dose dependent effect. Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
That totally answers the question. And an add-on to pivoting to Jessica is, can I be tested? Like, who should be tested? And there was a question at the beginning here from Jonathan, that if I get tested and there's no cure, is it just going to cause me unbelievable stress? So there's just been a lot of questions about, okay, I have Parkinson's or I have Alzheimer's or something in my family. My grandfather had this. Should I get tested? How do I get tested? And what does it cost? And does Medicare cover it?
That's a very good question. I have a lot of thoughts about this. So, I deal with not just Alzheimer's, but I deal with a lot of different genetic conditions with my patients. And this question always comes up, and sometimes it's a modifier, often it's a causal disease gene, and it's a family member. And almost, I'm going to come back to this, but a lot of the times we don't have a cure. Now, things are starting to change a little bit with Alzheimer's treatments, where APOE may have a different role. So I'm going to come back to that, but that's kind of nuanced. In general, there's no action that I'm going to offer based on an APOE or genetic status that's going to allow me to change what's going to happen next, except to go through with a fine-tooth comb any other risk factor or thing that you have that I can do something about, right? So, so there's that aspect of it, of high-risk individuals, making sure that they are optimized on their blood pressure and cholesterol and diabetes and all of those things. And if that's already being taken care of part of their routine health, great. But if not, definitely you want to be on top of that. And this might be kind of one way of thinking about framing that. But in all of these things, I always think about that patient and ask that patient, what do you want to do with this information? Right? How are you going to use it? Using it to stress, that doesn't sound helpful to anybody, right? So there are some people who use it because they want to plan. Even if it's knowing the probability is this, am I in the group that has a high risk? Am I in the group that has a lower risk? I know there's uncertainty. Maybe I don't have the APOE, but I have something else and I'm not even measuring the right thing. So, but on average, probabilistically, am I in high or low? Because I'm trying to figure out how much I want to invest in my whatever plan for retirement or whatever thing I'm setting up, right? So here's somebody who's a planner who really wants to know. Some people, so it comes down to that individual. I think they need counseling to do it right. So genetic counseling is a major part. It's part of what we offer at UCLA. Genetic counseling should always be given before somebody does a test to tell them, what exactly are you testing for? What is the consequence of this information one way or the other? And how is it going to potentially impact you? Then you get the test done, and then you sit down and discuss the results. You don't want to do something not even knowing what it means and then have to deal with it for the first time when you have a result, right? So that's how we do it in clinical genetics. And that's how we do this in our Alzheimer's clinic at UCLA. And it's very personalized and very tailored to every individual. And one needs to be thoughtful about the fact too, that, when you have genetic testing done by these 23andMe and other places on your own, like someone could ask you for that information someday. Do you know how that information can be used? Do you know how you're protected? So these are all additional considerations that people should stop and think about before they get genetic testing.
Monica, any other thoughts about a question that came in at registration is some things that I can do to protect myself? Any other thoughts on that? Since Jessica just touched on that. If you get genetic testing, it's a blueprint.
I really believe so much in this information should only set you up to do the things that we should do anyway, right? Everyone should have a will. Everyone should have their power of attorney, their advanced directives. So all of this stuff should be set up anyways. So just because it's safe, you get APOE tested and then you realize, oh, you're at an increased risk. What, now you're going to do it? Well, why wouldn't you have done it before? So I think that's a big takeaway when we really think about the ethic, the whole ethics of testing. It's like, well, what are we looking at? What, like Jessica said, what do you hope to get from this answer? I think we want answers. People want answers. People want to know yes or no, right? We are a society of yes or no and quick fixes, but that doesn't exist in this world. You can have the lowest risk of developing Alzheimer's, but still develop it. Like, you know, we've all known people who've been in terrible health their whole life, but they live to be like 85, 95, marathon runners who die young. So it's like, these are all just risks. So what we all should be doing is putting our wills, our decisions written down, talk to families, have these things planned for whatever our inevitability of life might be, whether it's Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, or getting hit by a bus. You know, it's like we always should prepare ourselves and our families for this no matter what.
I think that's really good advice to the entire audience and friends and family. It's better to be proactive and be able to react to something rather than, you know, in a panic, for sure. Speaking of that, there was a question, Casey, from Rita, and that is Egypt is very low in the African continent, India, the same, and Mexico. Any comments or speculations why those particular areas on your map have such a low incidence or risk?
I don't know. It could be sampling, but I'm actually unsure, and I don't even want to speculate as to the answer why, because it would probably just, yeah.
Probably you don't want to move there if you're worried.
Yeah, and I think that person was referring to the APOE E4 frequency graph that I pulled up, and so again, frequency does not equate to, you know, incident rate of the disease, and so that's a major point. But I don't know why one specific region might have a lower rate. It could be something as simple as, you know, the country, for example, might be more have more immigration and admixture. And so just a varying rate of E4. But I actually don't know. I'm literally just making educated guesses as I would as a scientist right now. But I'm unsure. So that's why, yeah.
So it's not the religion.
No, I don't think so.
Jessica, my sister at 69 had a major stroke causing aphasia and right side paralysis. Is this considered a vascular risk for dementia that increases brain disease like Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I noticed that there were a couple different questions about different kinds of dementia, and we didn't really talk much about that. So maybe I can broaden the question.
That would be great.
A little bit. You know, as I mentioned in my first slide, dementia kind of describes a functional state of somebody when they've had cognitive impairment that we don't think we can reverse from in some easy way. That's probably due to some injury or degenerative process. So that's a lot of different things. And that's Alzheimer's disease in some people who have Alzheimer's disease. Another common cause is called vascular dementia. And that can be either from big strokes that change somebody's ability to, you know, think, and then, you know, they never get better in that way and get worse. Potentially, if they have more strokes, there can be micro strokes in the brain that we don't even notice as strokes, but can make people think slower and slower and have dementia over time. That's called vascular dementia as well. Both of those are called vascular dementia. Somebody mentioned Lewy body disease. That's a different type of dementia. It's a little bit more in the Parkinson's family. Under the microscope, it looks more like Parkinson's, but it actually in a patient looks more like Alzheimer's disease. And then there's also this kind called frontotemporal dementia that somebody was mentioning in the chat. And of the ones I mentioned, that one has a very high genetic component, much more of the kind of many more cases that have one gene that's kind of determining whether or not you have it. That's much more predictive than even APOE, way more predictive than APOE. And I would advise anybody who's got frontotemporal dementia and hasn't had a conversation about genetics should have that with their doctors. and understand that more. It's nuanced, you know, but it's worth having. So all of these are different kinds of dementia. Now, I'm going to say one more thing about it. 60% of people have more than one kind when you look under the microscope in their brains after they've died. So there's a lot going on here. I think a lot of the modifiable risk factors that we described could be beneficial across the board. The effect of APOE is more of an AD related thing. The other disorders are maybe a little bit, it's quite variable, but nowhere near what it looks like in AD. And the genetics are quite different depending on the disorder. Vascular has the lowest genetic component that we can appreciate.
That actually answered a lot of questions. That was one, does the modifiable risk factors, if you adhere to that, help with Lewy body? And the answer is yes. And I also think I've heard a lot, and I think everyone would agree that what's good for the heart is good for the head. So it's probably a good thing to look at that slide again for the modifiable risk factors.
And I just wanted to add, you know, I think Dr. Russick brought up a really good point about, you know, looking under the microscope and how there's a lot of other, you know, proteins that are present that represent other dementias. It's the same thing with genetics. We talk about APOE4 a lot because APOE4 has the largest, most clear genetic risk associated with Alzheimer's. But there are other genetic risk factors that contribute to Alzheimer's and other dementias, but Alzheimer's disease. They have a much lower effect, but overall combined, you know, bigger effect. It's just that APOE4 has just overall large effect relative to the other one. So, you know, when we were talking about genetic testing, you know, it's just something to consider, you know, to not harp down on just APOE4, that there are other important genetic risk factors that, you know, we just don't touch on too much, like in these conversations, due to the smaller effect, but there is still an effect. So
It's the combination, I would assume.
yeah, and I hope, you know, Alzheimer's disease is very complex, right? We've talked about not just APOE4 and some proteins, but now we've already said that there are actually more genes and more proteins that contribute on top of these modifiable risk factors. And, you know, and this is, you know, the unfortunate state of the disease, you know, is that we don't have a clear cause yet, because there are so many contributing factors for it.
But it's a very helpful time. Yeah, you know, we're learning now so much. And I had meant to go back to the discussion about the new drugs and thinking about, like, this is kind of a case of using genetic testing for a reason. So the amyloid therapies, I'm sure everyone's read about in the news, are going to be available for people who meet the right criteria, who are at an early stage of disease where they clearly have that Alzheimer's protein in their brains, and that's the protein that the drug is targeting. So we should make sure they have it, and who are in the right early stage of disease that we think that they could potentially benefit from the drug. And in that instance, the protocols for figuring out how to give that drug, you know, do you give this much? How often do you give it? Actually depend on your APOE status. So now we have to test people who are going to get that drug for APOE so that we can use it to give them the safest dose for the drug. So it's a great example of where we're going in the field, because I'm sure it seems very frustrating to people right now that we have this incredible knowledge and we seem to then just be like, and there's nothing I can do for you. You know, I take that frustration into my lab every time I see a patient, but the field is doing incredible work in this space. And when we find these variants, we study them in detail, and we're trying to find therapies that work with them. And there's ones rolling out, you know, so here's an amyloid therapy where we use APOE to give it to people in the best possible way. You know, there's other therapies developing for some of the variants that are common in Parkinson's disease, but also in Lewy body disease. And, you know, if those drugs come up, they may be working for some people and differently than others based on their genetic makeup. So we're moving towards a future where we want to treat people as early as possible with drugs that are going to work. And we're going to use genetics to do that effectively. That's where this is going. So stay tuned. We're just not there yet. And where we are now is using the information to get a little bit more precision on, for people who know they've got it in their family, how could they use this information to stratify their risk and make sure that they're keeping themselves as healthy as possible with those modifiable factors.
A couple questions that came in, and Monica, chime in here, is a woman said that her mother was diagnosed after a 15-minute, appointment. So there's definitely the genetic risk factor, but the process of diagnosis, and I know Monica's dear friend, Dr. Kremen, is working on this, particular blood biomarkers to help determine a diagnosis. But any thoughts on that? Like, what's the progression here? I think I'm forgetting things, I'm losing my executive decision. I go to a neurologist, and then what is really the process and the time frame came by a couple questions.
I think that's a great question. So much also, we also have to look at the basic medical infrastructure. We have a large number of people who are growing older, and not everyone can, they don't have access to neurologists. They don't. So who do they get? They get their primary, who schedules them in for about a 15-minute appointment. They're 85 years old. They're a woman. They're experiencing cognitive complaints. The doctor will ask a few questions and say, well, most likely it's dementia or it's Alzheimer's disease. Here's some Aricept, and here you go, move on. I'll see you in a few months. That's not a proper diagnosis, but that's a very common diagnosis. That is a diagnosis that lots of people get when they just go to a primary. So we always encourage, when I talk about the Easton Center, I say that we have a neurology clinic where people can get a proper diagnosis, because there are people who come and they say, oh, I've been diagnosed with dementia. Well, that's not a diagnosis. That's just a word that is describing symptoms. So we want, okay, what's causing that dementia? And so we say, come and get the proper diagnosis, the proper evaluation, where it's going to be an hour plus evaluation. There's going to be writing down about your clinical symptoms, what's happening in your life. There's going to be blood draws. We need to see, is it a medication interaction? And then there's also going to be neuropsychological testing. It's all of these pieces, and plus maybe some imaging. Put all of this together, that's going to give you the proper diagnosis. It's not just going to be, I'm 85, I'm a woman, my mom had Alzheimer's. Oh, so it must be my a lot in life as well. So that's why we say, really, I think part of the importance of presentations like this is to get that information out, that is not a proper diagnosis, and to come to centers, UCLA, hey, go to USC, and let's go to a place in your community where you're able to get a proper, thorough diagnosis and evaluation. And, unfortunately, because of the impact of our society right now and the numbers and the basic infrastructure issues, it may take a while to get that proper appointment. I know someone in one of my support groups, her family member has an appointment in February for her first evaluation. We're in June. That's in 2024. And so not at UCLA though. So I'm just saying that. But it's saying that there are these basic barriers that exist, but still to push through, because it's very important to get a proper evaluation and to be a proper diagnosis, and to be the voice and the advocate for your family members. This isn't just talking, or, even for yourself. If you are concerned about your cognition, don't let a doctor blow you off. Let's talk about it. It could be medication interaction. It could be a thyroid problem. Let it be one of those. They're a lot easier to take care of. But if you don't get those treated or addressed, then you're never going to know, and you're going to live in the state of confusion. So it's very important for people to be their own advocates and to be the advocates for their family members.
What a great way to end, but I have two quick more questions that I think are pretty easy. One from Jill, and I think I could answer this, but I'll let one of you. With these new medications that are coming on that are very encouraging for treating Alzheimer's, not just masking the symptoms, but actually treating the progression of the disease, have you seen a bigger request for genetic testing?
Yes.
I was going to say yes, too. That's 4 nods. And then this is my favorite question regarding exercise. What type of exercise is recommended?
The one you love to do.
Yeah.
Could be for my grandmother, it was disco dancing in her living room. That was the only thing that actually we could recommend to her that she did that got her heart up. Everybody needs to find something that they love.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't
And I-
agree more.
I also like to say, I like to replace the word exercise with movement. It's like, because go ahead, as I say, make your annual gym donation. You pay that, you make your donation to 24-hour fitness and you never go. That's not going to help you, but get up and move. Take the further parking spot. Walk around the grocery store a little bit further, move. So I give everyone, when I give my own presentations, I say, okay, after the presentation, your homework is everyone here has to get up and walk for 5 minutes.
Take
Stretch.
the stairs.
Feel so much better anyway. And so that's always what I tell people. I'm like, it's movement. Exercise is daunting. Like it's a marathon. Ugh. It's like, no, don't just get up and move and do what you enjoy.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you, UCLA. Thank you, Casey, Monica, and Jessica. And thank you to our audience. And thank you to Kensington Senior Living. And remember, you will all receive a copy of this amazing presentation to share with your friends and family. And thank you again. And be safe and good evening, good afternoon, or have a good dinner wherever you are on the coast. Take care.